This girl only knows how to take notes. The money came from her brother. The words rang out in the middle of a community meeting at the old church in the town of Madison, just as everyone was standing to applaud a 6-figure grant and the person who hadn't created it. I stood a step behind the rows of chairs, my hand gripping my document bag, watching someone else's name being read aloud at the podium, while 3 years of going door to door, knocking on every door, raising every dollar for that project, were never mentioned. In that moment, I realized something more frightening than having my work stolen. It wasn't that they didn't know the truth. It was that they didn't need to know it. This story isn't about money. It's about the moment my name was erased from the very thing I created, in front of the entire community, and the moment I decided not to ask for justice back, but to lock it away for good. And that is the story of Claire Wilson. Someone once said, "Family is the place where you don't have to speak up to be protected." But what if family is the first place that takes your voice away? What would you do? I'm Lisa. Before I tell this story, let me ask you, where are you listening from? Morning, afternoon, or evening? If that question made you pause for a beat, leave a comment, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me until the end of this video. I attended the grant announcement as family support. That was the phrase my mother used when she introduced me to the people seated around us. Gentle, just polite enough, and vague enough that no one asked anything more. I chose a spot in the back, near the row of stained glass windows chipped along the edges. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the old glass, casting mottled colors across the floor, peaceful enough to make me feel out of place. On the recognition board hanging in front of the podium, there was only one name printed in bold: Ethan Wilson. My younger brother. He stood upright in the front row, hands clasped together, his face trying to hold humility while his eyes shone bright. When the moderator read his name, applause burst out. I clapped too, steady, not fast, not slow, like a stranger in the room. My mother turned toward me and smiled. The smile she used in family photos, warm enough to reassure outsiders, contained enough that no one could see anything behind it. My father sat beside her, nodding lightly with each round of applause, his eyes never leaving the podium. No one looked my way, and no one needed to. I reached up and touched the document bag strapped across my chest. Inside were copies I always carried with me, a habit formed during years of deadlines and promises. 3 years. 3 years of evenings driving through small towns around Madison, of meetings canceled at the last minute, of sitting at strangers' kitchen tables explaining why this old church deserved to be saved. I remembered every number, every thank you email, every hesitant handshake that eventually turned into a yes. I stood there, clapping for an achievement I knew I wasn't allowed to claim. The truth hit me, cold and unmistakable. They hadn't made a mistake. They were celebrating on my sweat, right in front of me. I took a breath, clearly smelling old wood and candle wax in the air. For a moment, I almost stepped forward. Just one step. Enough to stand level with the front row. Enough for someone to have to see me. But my feet didn't move. I let my hands fall, let the applause end as if it had never belonged to me. When the meeting shifted to commemorative photos, I stepped back another pace, making room for those who wanted to stand closer to the podium. As people laughed and talked, something became very clear. So clear it didn't need a name. This wasn't an accident. My name hadn't disappeared by oversight. It had been crossed out before the meeting even began. And if I stayed silent today, tomorrow, they would keep calling it obvious. We went home after the meeting, the kitchen lights on like every other Sunday night. My mother set a bottle of wine on the table and poured 3 glasses, her movement so familiar she didn't need to look. Ethan retold the meeting with excitement, emphasizing every stage of the fundraising as if it had been his personal journey. He talked about phone calls, meetings, handshakes, the things I had done, now reshaped through his voice into a smoother, cleaner story. I leaned against the kitchen counter, unpinned the community badge from my coat, and set it beside the keys. My mother turned to me just as Ethan paused to take a breath. "She was great support," she said, her tone softening, then quickly added, "But the idea was Ethan's." The way she edited me out was as natural as brushing crumbs off the edge of a plate. No one felt the need to apologize. My father sat down, pulled out his napkin, slow as always. He didn't look at me. "Our family needs a representative," he said, his voice low and firm. The sentence landed in the middle of the table, heavy enough to stop any argument, familiar enough to raise no questions. Ethan smiled and lightly clinked his glass against my mother's. The sound of glass was dry and sharp. I pulled out a chair, sat down, and pushed my plate forward. A relative called to congratulate us, put on speakerphone. The cheerful voice repeated Ethan's name, repeated vision and effort. My mother handed him the phone, her eyes sliding past me the way they slide past a tool that's already done its job. When the call ended, she turned and placed her hand on the back of mine. A brief touch, just enough for outsiders to believe it was concern. "You're good at what you do. Why compete with your brother for credit?" she said, light as reassurance. Has anyone ever heard a sentence like that in their own family? If you've been in that position, hit like or leave a single dot. So I know I'm not the only one. Her voice wasn't raised, not harsh, but it sealed everything in place. I didn't answer. I tapped my fork lightly against the rim of the plate, a sound so soft only I could hear it. In my head, I didn't feel anger. I felt a clean, smooth cold opening up. And inside that cold, I began to remember, not to argue, but to not forget. That night, when the house had gone quiet, I carried my document bag into my room and set it on the small desk by the window. The desk lamp clicked on, casting a warm circle over stacks of papers worn at the corners. I opened my laptop and logged into my inbox, letting the screen take a few extra seconds to load. Outside, wind moved through the maple trees, dry leaves brushing lightly against the glass. I began reviewing emails, one by one, in chronological order. Familiar subject lines appeared: meeting schedules, confirmations, thank you notes after each conversation. I opened attachments, checked signatures, compared dates. The final grant contract was still there, my name sitting neatly under primary fundraiser. The donor meeting schedule stretched across 3 years. Every evening, every weekend. Everything was in my name, not a single line missing. My phone vibrated, cutting through the rhythm of typing. An unknown number. I answered. A woman's voice came through, polite and slightly hesitant. She was one of the first donors, the one who had invited me into her kitchen to talk over hot tea. "You weren't at the announcement?" she asked. "I looked for you and couldn't find you. I thought you might be busy." I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the dark street. A car passed, red taillights streaking by before disappearing. I replied briefly that I had a family matter. She made a bit of small talk and wished me a good evening. When the call ended, I didn't go back to the desk right away. I stood still for another beat, letting the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen fill the space. I returned to the desk, reopened the contract, and dragged the cursor down the list of signatures. In that instant, a sharp thought cut through the fog. They hadn't forgotten my name. They had seen it, read it, and chosen to cross it out. Right then, I realized, they didn't forget my name. They erased it on purpose. I closed the laptop and placed both hands on the desk. The wood felt cold under my palms. In the quiet room, the sentence echoed in my head like an irreversible reminder. When silence stretches on, it becomes permission. I took a deep breath, packed the papers back into the bag, and zipped it closed. Not yet. Not time to speak. Not time to stand up in front of everyone. I turned off the desk lamp, letting the room sink into darkness, carrying with me a small but clear decision. I wouldn't strike back yet. Not out of fear, but because some steps need to land in the right place. The next morning, I waited until only my mother and I were in the kitchen. Ethan had left early. My father was in the garage. My mother stood with her back to me, washing coffee cups, water running steadily. I set my bag down on a chair, pulled out the chair across from the table, and sat. No circling. I asked directly why my name hadn't been on the recognition board the night before. My mother's hand froze mid-motion. She turned off the tap and faced me, her eyes reddening quickly, as if the question had been waiting to turn into tears. "You're making this into too big a deal," she said, her voice trembling. "Such a good thing, and you have to stir it up." She pulled a tissue and wiped the corners of her eyes, movements so familiar they made my stomach turn. I knew the role I was meant to play. Silence in exchange for what they called family peace. This time, I refused to step onto that stage. Ethan walked in right then, chewing toast and smiling. "You're too sensitive," he said, leaning against the fridge. "Everyone knows you're behind it anyway. Why list so many names and complicate things?" The words drifted easily through the air, as if my question were a minor detail not worth pausing breakfast for. My mother placed her hand on the table and leaned toward me. "If you wanted recognition, why didn't you say something from the start?" The question came out in a soothing tone, but it blocked every way back. I looked at the fine cracks in the wooden tabletop, counted the faint scratches I'd cleaned around for years. I didn't answer. My throat went dry, not from lack of words, but because any words now felt unnecessary. I stood, walked into the bathroom, and closed the door. The fluorescent light flicked on, reflecting my face in the mirror, strangely calm. I was standing in the old bathroom of my own home, looking back at myself. And you, where are you listening to this story right now? In your kitchen, in your car, or in a quiet room? I placed both hands on the sink and looked straight into my eyes. In that mirror, I saw something that had followed me for a long time. I was always the one who had to explain why I was there, why I deserved to stand where I stood. I turned off the light and stepped back out. My mother and Ethan were still in the kitchen, continuing their unfinished conversation as if I'd never asked anything. I grabbed my coat and keys. When the door closed behind me, no one called after me. There was only a clean, cold clarity. My boundary had been mocked, but it had also taken shape. That afternoon, just as I parked in front of my apartment, my phone buzzed nonstop. A message from an unknown number came first, followed by an email with a short subject line that made my hand pause on the steering wheel. The city council had sent an invitation, not to me, but to Ethan. The confirmation stated he would represent the project at next week's session, with authority to sign off on the next stages of implementation. I sat still for another beat, listening to the engine fade, a chill running down my spine. If that signature went down, everything would close. There would be no way for my name to return, no footnote to fix. A new page would be printed, clean, neat, and I would be only support in the town's official story. I opened the email and scrolled to the bottom. Date, time, location, attendee list. Every detail was clear. Linda called right after. Her voice was low, fast, no small talk. She said she'd heard about the meeting, that my name wasn't on any of the documents being circulated. "If they sign, it's over," she said. "You won't have a way back in." I thanked her, hung up, and leaned against the car door. Afternoon wind moved through the lot, carrying the smell of damp grass and gasoline. I climbed the stairs, unlocked the door, and dropped my bag on the floor. The room was so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking. I moved between the kitchen and living room, straightening things that were already in place. By the time night fully settled, I still hadn't turned on the lights. Darkness softened edges, blurred boundaries. They didn't just take credit for my work. They were going to rewrite history. The sentence flashed through my head, as clear as if it had been spoken out loud in an empty room. I sat down on the edge of the bed, opened my phone, then turned it face down without reading another message. That night, I tossed and turned, counting every car passing outside every time the clock struck. In that hazy space between waking and sleep, the image of my mother crying, my father staying silent, Ethan's quick smile, each flickered and disappeared. There was a brief moment, very brief, when I considered letting it all slide, letting Sunday dinner go on like it always had. The thought touched me and pulled back, like a hand brushing the edge of cold water. As dawn crept closer, I sat up, drew the curtains, and watched the first light slip into the room. I didn't say my decision out loud, but I stood with a new kind of certainty. This time, I wasn't going to wait anymore. I called a lawyer that morning, after making coffee, but before taking a single sip. Her office sat on the corner of a low building near the town square, where the city flag flew year-round. I arrived 10 minutes early and waited in the reception area, watching people move along the street through frosted glass. When I was invited in, I set my document bag on the table, unzipped it, and laid everything out in the order I'd arranged the night before. The attorney read slowly, asked short questions. I answered just enough, without adding anything extra. She compared signatures, dates, confirmation emails. At one point, she paused and gave a very slight nod. "Legally," she said, "you're the primary fundraiser. That gives you the right to request a temporary freeze on disbursement if the conditions are changed." I didn't ask her to repeat it. I simply pulled the stack back toward me and turned to the next page. The numbers sat there neatly, as clear as they had always been. After I left the office, I walked a few loops around the square, letting the wind steady my breathing. I stopped by an office supply store and bought a new heavy folder and a few binder clips. Small, concrete errands, enough to keep my mind from drifting too far. Back home, I turned on my computer, printed extra copies, and marked what needed marking. Each time a clip snapped shut, the metal clicked cleanly, decisively. I'm not taking it back. I'm locking it down. I didn't say it out loud, but it stayed with me all afternoon. I worked in silence, turned off my phone notifications, and didn't respond to a single message from my family. The clock on the wall kept moving. 72 hours broke into manageable pieces. A morning signing paperwork, an afternoon sending the official email, an evening waiting for confirmation. I had no intention of showing up in front of anyone. No speech, no confrontational call. I just put everything back where it belonged, then stepped back. When the last email went out, I closed my laptop and leaned into my chair. Outside, the sky had darkened. I waited, unhurried. Sometimes staying out of the spotlight is the surest way to see what happens next. Dinner went on as if the days before it had never existed. My mother set the roast on the table, adjusted the tablecloth, asked if I wanted more potatoes. My father turned on the local news, the volume just high enough to fill the empty spaces. Ethan sat across from me, flipping through his printed pages, showing off the opening lines of tomorrow's speech. He read a few sentences out loud, paused for a reaction, then continued, his voice getting steadier. I took bites, chewed slowly, kept my eyes on the rim of my plate. "Tomorrow I'll emphasize community spirit," Ethan said without looking up. People like hearing that stuff. My mother nodded and added more gravy to his plate. "Just say it the right way." She turned to me, her voice light but clear. "Don't do anything that makes people uncomfortable. This is going well." I set my fork down, wiped my hands, opened my purse, and pulled out the thick folder of contracts. I placed it on the table, right between the two dinner plates. The papers rose under the light, the edges straight and new. My mother froze. My father glanced over it, then went back to the screen. Ethan stopped reading, darted a quick look at it, and his smile sagged for a single second. I didn't say anything. I just let the folder sit there, present, like a weight that needed to be acknowledged. Then I pulled it back toward me, slipped it into my bag, and zipped it up. The zipper closing sounded clean, final. Ethan laughed, trying to lighten the room. "You've always loved paperwork," he said. I nodded and took a sip of water. Somewhere else in this house, or in any house like it, there are dinners that stay peaceful only when one person chooses silence. A storyteller would say that kind of quiet is often mistaken for harmony. I stood to clear the plates and carried them into the kitchen. My mother followed, lowering her voice. "Don't ruin this." I nodded, didn't argue. My father turned off the TV and told everyone to get to bed early. Ethan gathered his pages, stacked them neatly, ready for tomorrow. Upstairs, I set my bag on the chair, checked my phone once, then powered it off. Outside the window, street lights blinked on one by one. I lay down, eyes open, counting my breathing. Tomorrow, everything would stop. The city council meeting began on time. I sat in the back row near the aisle, where the scrape of chairs and the flip of paper were the loudest. Ethan stood at the podium in a crisp suit, his pages set neatly in front of him. He started his speech in that familiar, confident tone, hitting the words he knew would earn nods. I looked up at the wall clock, its minute hand moving slow, steady. When it came time to sign, the council chair cleared his throat and exchanged a quick word with the clerk. There was a short pause, no longer than a breath, but enough to change the color of the room. "Before we proceed," he said, "we need to inform everyone. The grant funds are being temporarily frozen at the lawful request of the primary fundraiser." A murmur rose like a low wave. Ethan jerked still, his eyes dropping to the page, then lifting. My mother, seated up front, turned halfway around. My father leaned forward as if to hear better. When I was called, I stood, stepped one pace out of the aisle, and handed my file to the clerk. The papers were passed along, opened, checked. My name appeared on the screen behind them, not big, not bold, just in the right place. "I'm not accusing anyone," I said when the chair asked a brief question. My voice stayed even. No need to lift it. "I'm just confirming the truth." I pointed to timelines, signatures, clauses. No commentary. I didn't look at my family. The numbers stood up and spoke for themselves. The chair nodded and motioned for the clerk to continue. "Under the original conditions," he said, "the funding will be redirected to the implementing body aligned with the proper file, with a new oversight mechanism." The screen changed pages. A line reading "Additional Conditions" appeared. No one signed. No one was allowed to sign yet. Ethan took a step back from the podium, his arms hanging loose at his sides. The nodding from earlier stopped. I returned to my seat, opened my notebook, and wrote one short line. In that room, the order had shifted by one notch. No shouting, no wreckage. Only the signature's place had moved, and with it, power had turned. My phone started ringing the moment I left the meeting room. I let it vibrate inside my coat pocket and walked into the hallway, where cold light spilled across the stone floor. The buzzing stopped, then started again. Messages poured in. My mother's name first, then my father's, then Ethan's number. I reached the parking lot, opened my door, slid into the driver's seat, and shut the door to muffle everything. I still didn't start the car. My mother called last. I answered when the dashboard clock rolled into the next minute. She spoke fast, no greeting, her voice cracking mid-sentence. She said I'd shattered the family, that what happened this morning was a slap across their faces in front of the entire town. Behind her, I could hear my father's voice, chairs scraping, dishes clinking. I rested my hand on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield. No arguing, no explaining. Ethan called right after, his voice higher than usual. He talked about compromise, about handling it at home. I ended the call, powered my phone off, and set it face down on the passenger seat. Not because I had nothing left to say, because anything I said would pull me back into the old role. I drove home, parked in front of my apartment, and sat still for another beat. In the elevator, the mirror reflected my face, tired but not messy. I went into the kitchen, poured water, and drank slowly. The noise from earlier settled, leaving a space big enough for thought to pass through. For the first time in my life, I didn't apologize for protecting myself. If you've made it this far, how do you feel about me? Leave an emoji. That sentence didn't come with victory. It was heavy, like something that had just been set down on the floor. I wondered if I'd gone too far. A question that arrived late, but mattered. I sat on the edge of the chair and let the question sit there, neither pushing it away nor holding it tight. Linda stopped by that night with 2 coffees. She set a cup down, looked at me for a moment, then said softly, "You didn't break anything. You just stopped allowing it." Short. No advice attached. I nodded, didn't answer. We sat in silence while the espresso machine in the next apartment clicked and hissed, sealing the quiet. Night fell. I turned my phone back on and saw a stack of missed calls lined up in a row. I didn't call back. I let the screen go dark and stood to draw the curtains. Outside, the city kept moving to its own rhythm. I chose silence, not to hide, but to hold on to what I'd just claimed, even though the price of it still hurt. The project continued, on the revised timeline. Meetings ran clean, documents went to the right people, signatures landed in the right places. I showed up as the legal fundraiser, with no one from my family beside me. No more celebration dinners after meetings. No more check-in calls that came with an agenda. Everything ran smoothly, so quietly that sometimes I had to remind myself that quiet can be its own kind of progress. I lost Sunday dinner. The familiar kitchen no longer called to me, the chair that used to be mine sitting empty. In return, my name appeared where it needed to appear, on paperwork, on meeting schedules, in confirmation emails. I didn't celebrate it. I just worked. Every day I opened my laptop, checked the list, and crossed things off. Steady. No show. I didn't win completely. Some nights I came home late to an apartment that stayed too quiet for too long, and I stood at the window watching streetlights blink on and off. The cost of justice, for me, was a temporary loneliness. But inside that loneliness, I could breathe. I no longer had to explain why I was there, or ask permission to stand where I belonged. Boundaries aren't betrayal. They're just the name for things I used to keep blurred. I learned to say less and make more clear. I learned not to apologize for protecting myself. My freedom wasn't loud, but it was strong enough to stand on every morning. The story you just heard is a fictional story, inspired by real-life situations and human experiences, meant to offer reflection and emotional value for viewers. The content does not encourage anyone to imitate any actions, but invites each person to look back at their own boundaries and choices. In the narrator's view, sometimes the bravest thing isn't winning an argument. It's keeping your name, keeping your right to stand upright in your own story. If there's a small gift for you after listening, it's this reminder: you don't need to be loud to be respected. You just need to be consistent with what's right for you. I'm Lisa. Thank you for staying until the last minute. Where are you listening from? A quiet morning, a rushed afternoon, or a late night? leave a comment. Hit like if this story reached you, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.